A cracked windshield, a grease-stained uniform that used to belong to someone else. That's what I had the morning everything changed. I was 43 years old, running electrical wire through a renovated townhouse on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. My knees ached from kneeling on concrete. My hands were calloused in ways that would have seemed impossible to the version of me who used to sit in board meetings and argue about quarterly projections. I'd been doing this kind of work, subcontract electrical, mostly residential, for about 14 months, not because I wanted to, because it was the only thing left after everything else burned down. I keep a photo of my son, Brendan, in my chest pocket. He's 8 in the picture, gap-toothed, standing in front of a go-kart at his birthday party. Every time I zip up the work jacket in the morning, I touch that pocket without thinking about it. Like a reflex, like a prayer. I'm telling you this so you understand who I was when I walked into that building. Not a tragic figure, not a man who'd given up. Just a guy trying to keep his son in weekend soccer league and his truck out of the impound lot. My name is Kevin Marsh, and I used to run a company. 12 years ago, I was a project manager at Holloway Integrated Systems, a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm based in Cincinnati. We did municipal contracts, bridges, water treatment facilities, power grid upgrades. Unglamorous work that kept cities running. I loved it. I was good at it. By the time I was 31, I'd managed 11 projects and brought in roughly $40 million in contract value over 3 years. My boss, a man named Douglas Fitch, told me I was the most reliable project manager he'd ever worked with. Douglas was the kind of man who arrived early and left late. He'd built the company from a 2-person operation in the mid-90s into a 70-employee firm that had contracts in 6 states. He treated me like a son, or at least I thought he did. He pushed me to take the PMP certification. He put me in client meetings most junior managers never got near. He called me the future of this place at my 7th-year review. My wife at the time, Sandra, told me not to get too comfortable. She had a way of looking at things without sentiment that I sometimes found cold and sometimes found useful. Companies change, she said one night over dinner. Priorities change. Don't let a man's approval become your retirement plan. I didn't listen. I married Sandra when I was 28. She was a pharmaceutical sales rep, sharp and self-possessed, the kind of woman who remembered every detail of every conversation and used them strategically. We had Brendan 3 years into the marriage. For a while, things were fine, not warm, exactly, but functional. We had a house in Westerville, 2 car payments, a shared calendar packed with Brendan's activities and networking events. A life that looked correct from the outside. What I didn't see, or maybe what I refused to see, was that Sandra had started spending more time with a man named Clifford Reese. He was a senior partner at a corporate law firm downtown. Tall, early 50s, drove a Mercedes SL and had the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to hustle for anything. I met him twice at industry events. He shook my hand with too much eye contact and called me buddy. I found out about the affair the same week I found out I was losing my job. Douglas had retired 8 months earlier, quietly, almost apologetically, handing the reins to his nephew, a man named Brett Holloway who'd spent most of his career in commercial real estate and had very specific opinions about dead weight in an organization. Brett walked through the office like a man taking inventory. He wore slim-cut suits and talked about right-sizing the way people talk about the weather, casually, without real concern for what it costs. He called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. The blinds were half closed. There was a bottle of water on the desk that he didn't offer to share. "We're restructuring the project management division," he said. "Your position is being eliminated." I asked if this was about performance. He smiled. Not a warm smile, it's about direction. I was escorted out by 2 o'clock. My keycard stopped working before I reached the elevator. That evening, I found a text thread on Sandra's phone that I was never meant to see. Clifford. Restaurants I'd never been taken to. A weekend in Asheville I thought was her girl's trip. Words I won't repeat here. I sat in my car in our driveway for 40 minutes. The garage light was on. I could see Brendan's bike propped against the wall inside. I went back in and made dinner. I didn't say anything. I don't know why. Maybe I needed one more night of it looking normal. 2 weeks later, Sandra told me she wanted a divorce. She said it the way you'd say you wanted a different table at a restaurant. No drama, no apology. Just a direction she'd decided on. The divorce took 11 months. Clifford's firm didn't represent her. Conflict of interest, but the attorney she hired had clearly learned at the same school. I lost the house. I got Brendan on alternating weekends and Thursday evenings. I walked out with my truck, my tools, a storage unit full of furniture, and a severance that ran out in 4 months. What I didn't lose, and this matters, was my electrician's license. I'd gotten it years ago in my 20s before the corporate track took over. It was a backup plan I'd almost forgotten about. Now it was the only plan I had. I won't romanticize what the next 2 years looked like. They were hard in the specific grinding way that doesn't make for good storytelling. Late invoices, a landlord who knocked on my door twice, a truck repair I charged to a credit card and paid off over 8 months. I took any job I could get. I worked fast and I didn't complain, and slowly I started getting referrals. By the time I was 43, I was doing okay. Not great. enough to keep Brendan's soccer fees paid and put a little aside each month. I had a small crew of 2 guys who worked with me on bigger jobs. I had a van, secondhand but reliable. I had a routine. I told myself that was enough. The job that changed everything was a renovation project to a short north neighborhood. A 4-unit townhouse conversion, high-end finish, the kind of work that pays well because the general contractor expects 0 mistakes and 0 delays. I'd been on site for 3 days when I was sent to the 2nd unit to trace a fault in the panel wiring. The building was mostly empty. The other contractors had wrapped up for the day. It was quiet in the way old buildings get quiet when you're the only one left, just the hum of the city outside and the sound of your own tools. I was crouched behind a utility closet, running a wire tracer along the conduit when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belong to someone who's not in a hurry because they've earned the right not to be. An old man appeared in the doorway. He was maybe 75, maybe older, lean with thick white hair and the kind of posture that used to belong to someone much younger. He wore a wool blazer over a flannel shirt. He held a travel mug in one hand and looked at me the way you look at something you weren't expecting but aren't entirely surprised by either. "You're Kevin Marsh," he said. Not a question. I set down the wire tracer. "I am." He didn't move from the doorway. He just kept looking at me, and there was something in his expression I couldn't read, something between recognition and grief. "Your father was Raymond Marsh," he said. I stood up slowly. "He was. We built something together," the old man said. "A long time ago. I've been trying to find you for 2 years. His name was Arthur Pelham. He was 81 years old. And what he told me next, leaning against that doorframe in a half-renovated townhouse in Columbus, Ohio, took about 2 hours and rearranged everything I thought I knew about my life. My father died when I was 7 years old. A cardiac event, sudden without warning on a Tuesday morning in February. I don't have many clear memories of him. I have impressions. The smell of sawdust and coffee. Hands that seemed enormous when they held mine. A laugh that came from somewhere deep. My mother, June, raised me alone after that. She worked as a school administrator, careful with money, quiet about grief. She didn't talk about my father often, and when she did, it was with a tenderness that felt like it belonged to her alone, something she wasn't quite ready to share. She passed away 4 years ago, just before my marriage started to come apart. Breast cancer, diagnosed late. She went quickly, which the hospice nurse said was a mercy. I thought I knew my father's story. Electrical contractor, small operation, died young. That was the shape of it. In 1987, my father and Arthur had co-founded a company called Meridian Utility Partners, a commercial electrical contracting firm that specialized in large-scale industrial installations, power plants, manufacturing facilities, data centers before anyone called them that. My father had the technical expertise, Arthur had the business relationships and the capital. They'd built it together over 6 years, from 2 trucks and a rented warehouse to a company with 40 employees and contracts in 4 states. When my father died in 1991, Arthur had bought out the estate's shares at fair market value, about $380,000 at the time, and placed the proceeds in a trust in 1E5. That was the agreement he and my father had made, documented in their partnership contract. "I was the trustee," Arthur said. "I had an obligation to notify you." He stopped, looked at his coffee mug. "Your mother and I had a falling out the year after Raymond died. I won't go into this. Changed her number. I tried twice and then I let it go. That's on me. I've carried it a long time. I didn't say anything. The trust sat untouched," he said, "the original $380,000. When I couldn't locate you, I reinvested the principal into company equity as the trust documents permitted. I kept meticulous records. I never touched a cent that wasn't mine." He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and took out a folded document. He held it out to me and waited. I took it, unfolded it. The paper was thick, the kind that comes from a law firm that's been in business since before you were born. The number at the bottom of the page was $2.4 million. I read it twice, then a third time. "The company's grown," Arthur said simply. "We went through a rough patch in 2008 like everyone else, but the last decade's been strong. Data center infrastructure, EV charging installation contracts, hospital expansions. The industry changed in ways Raymond would have loved." I was still holding the paper. "That's the current trust valuation," Arthur said. "Your principal plus 34 years of allocated equity return. I've had an estate attorney and a CPA working on the documentation for the past 18 months. Once I found you, once I could actually put this in front of you, everything's in order." I looked up at him. "Why now?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm 81, he said, "and I made a promise to your father." I drove home that night in a kind of silence I'd never experienced before. Not peaceful silence, something more like the moment after a very loud sound stops when your ears are still adjusting. I called my lawyer the next morning, not a fancy attorney, just a guy I'd used for the divorce who was competent and reasonably priced. His name was Pete, and he answered on the second ring, and when I explained what I had, he went quiet for a few seconds. "Send me everything," he said. "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, don't have any more meetings without me." The next 6 weeks were the most disorienting of my life, which is saying something given the previous 2 years. Pete brought in a forensic accountant named Claudia who went through 34 years of trust records with the kind of focus that made me tired just watching her work. She found no irregularities. Arthur, it turned out, had done exactly what he said, reinvested, documented, reported to the IRS as required, kept every record. Whoever this man is, Claudia told me, he's either the most honest trustee I've ever audited or the most sophisticated fraudster. But the paper trail is clean. I can't find a single dollar out of place. Arthur's estate attorney, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, met with Pete and walked through the transfer process. The trust had been properly structured. The documentation was complete. The transfer, once executed, would be clean and legally sound. I want to be honest about what those 6 weeks felt like because I think the easy version of this story would skip over it. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like standing on ground that kept shifting. Every time I thought I understood what was happening, some new document or legal clarification would arrive and I'd have to recalibrate. I thought about my mother a lot, about what she'd known, what she hadn't, about the falling out with Arthur that she'd never mentioned. I felt angry at her sometimes in those weeks, and then I'd feel guilty about the anger, and then I'd sit with Brendan on a Thursday evening watching whatever he wanted to watch on TV, and I'd think, she kept you fed and clothed and present. She worked every day and asked for nothing. She didn't tell you because maybe she didn't know the full picture. Maybe she was protecting something she thought was too complicated to explain to a child, and then it was too late. I'm still working through that part. The transfer closed on a Wednesday. My attorney called me at 7:42 in the morning. I was in the van outside a job site in Dublin, Ohio, drinking coffee from a thermos. It's done, Pete said. The trust assets are yours. I sat in the van for a while after I hung up. The radio was on, a country station I defaulted to months ago and never changed. Someone was singing about going back to a place they used to know. I turned it off. I didn't call anyone. There was no one obvious to call. My closest friend, a guy named Terry I'd known since college, had moved to Portland 2 years back and we'd lost the rhythm of keeping in touch. My sister Donna lived in Charlotte and we spoke occasionally, holidays, Brendan's birthdays. I wasn't ready to say it out loud to anyone who would make it feel like a celebration because it didn't feel like a celebration yet. It felt like being handed something you'd needed for a long time in a room you didn't expect by someone you'd never met. I went inside and did the electrical work because the job needed to be finished and the crew was waiting and that's who I'd trained myself to be. Here's what I did and didn't do with the money because I think this matters. I didn't buy anything for the first 30 days. That was a rule I set for myself without quite knowing why. I kept running my jobs, I kept picking up Brendan on Thursday evenings. I paid off the credit card and the truck loan and I sat with the rest of it and tried to understand what I actually wanted. I signed Brendan up for the select soccer league he'd been too expensive for. That was the first thing. He cried, actually, not dramatically, just got very quiet and then looked away from me and I could see his shoulders shaking a little. He's 12 now, nearly 13. He pretends not to need things the way kids do when they've watched their parent not have much. I moved into a better apartment, not a mansion, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I liked with a decent kitchen and enough room for Brendan to have his own space when he was with me. I bought Arthur Pelham lunch. We met at a diner he liked near his office. He had the same wool blazer. He ordered black coffee and a club sandwich and he didn't make any speeches. We talked about my father, about what he'd been like at 28, at 30, at 36 when he died. Arthur told me things no one else alive could tell me, that my father had a habit of sketching circuits on napkins during meetings, that he'd been stubborn about safety standards to the point of losing 2 contracts over it, that he'd cried at Arthur's daughter's wedding, not because he was sentimental but because he'd told Arthur that morning he wasn't sure he'd ever have kids of his own, and then 6 months later he'd called Arthur from the hospital to say my mother had gone into labor with me. I didn't cry at lunch. I waited until I was in the parking lot. There are things people want to know when they hear a story like this. They want to know about Sandra. Whether I rubbed it in, whether there was a moment where she found out and I got to watch her face. The honest answer is that I didn't seek that out, and when it happened anyway, it wasn't what I expected. She found out through Brendan, indirectly. He mentioned the new apartment, the soccer league, some other detail, and she did the math. She texted me one evening. Not a long message. Just, I heard things changed for you. Good for you, Kevin. No apology, no acknowledgement of what the divorce had cost me. Just that. I looked at the message for a long time. I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the driveway that night, the garage light, Brendan's bike, the dinner I made without saying anything. I typed back, yeah. Things changed, and I put the phone down. Clifford Reese, from what I understand, is still at his law firm, still drives the Mercedes. Sandra seems happy, or at least comfortable, which I've accepted is probably as close to happy as she gets. I don't spend much time thinking about either of them anymore. That surprised me more than almost anything else in this story, how little I needed the satisfaction of their knowing. Brett Holloway's right-sizing of Holloway Integrated Systems, I discovered, had not gone as planned. He'd lost 4 senior project managers in 18 months and blown 2 major municipal contracts over missed deadlines. The firm was still operating, but at roughly 60% of what it had been under Douglas. I heard this through an industry contact, casually, the way you hear most things that matter after they've already stopped mattering. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter, like watching a weather pattern from a distance and realizing you'd gotten out of the way in time. What I've come back to in the months since the transfer is my father's hands. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean that I think about what he built with his hands and his mind and his willingness to work alongside a partner who complemented him in the ways he lacked. He didn't get to see it become what it became. He didn't know what 34 years of compound growth would look like on a trust statement. He just built something solid and trusted that it would hold. I've been having conversations with Arthur about Meridian's future. Not about control. Arthur's son, a civil engineer named Greg, runs operations day to day and runs them well. But Arthur has mentioned, more than once, that my father's name should be somewhere in the company's story, that the history should reflect who actually built it. I don't know yet what that looks like. Maybe a seat at the table in some capacity, maybe something else. We're still talking. What I do know is that I'm not in a hurry. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm behind. I still carry Brendan's photo in my chest pocket, the gap-toothed one from his birthday. I still touch it in the morning without thinking about it. Some things you keep no matter what else changes. People sometimes ask me what the lesson is. What I'd tell someone going through the kind of years I went through, the job, the marriage, the scraping by period that stretches longer than you think it can. I don't have a clean answer. I'm suspicious of clean answers. What I have is this: I was doing electrical work in an empty building on an ordinary afternoon, and an old man walked through a door and said my name. Everything that came after that had been waiting for 34 years. All I'd done was show up and be findable. You can't control what's been set in motion before you knew there was a motion to track. You can't rush what hasn't arrived yet. You can do the work in front of you, keep the people who matter close, and try to stay the kind of person who, when something good finally turns the corner, recognizes it and doesn't run. I have a lunch with Arthur again next week. I'm going to bring Brendan this time. I think it's time for those two to meet.